This paper on collective information security in large-scale urban protests, the case of Hong Kong, is co-authored with 3 great people. While I'm a qualitative social scientist, I'm Rikke. My co-authors are cryptographers and computer scientists Martin Albrecht, Jorge Blasco, and Lenka Mareková. And the underlying premise of this paper is that in order to design secure communication technologies that meet the needs of people, participants in large-scale urban protests, in our case, we need to understand what those needs actually are. So this means engaging with people in protest to understand how they use security technologies in these settings, where these technologies succeed and where they fail, and also how existing technologies are appropriated for the social environments within which they're being used. So this is really kind of what we set out to do in this paper. So why are we focusing on Hong Kong? Well, the anti-extradition law amendment bill protests, or the anti-ELAP protests in 2019 and 20, are useful as a case study to unearth very specific security needs of protesters for a number of reasons. So first, these protests were highly digitalized. Most activities had a digital component in the form of different modes of digital communication and technologies, but also these protests were highly mobile. And this form of mobility was partly facilitated by digital technology, such as, for instance, messaging applications and online forums. The protests were also seen as innovative in their protest tactics. So, for example, the use of the term frontliner to denote someone who was likely to see engagement with law enforcement. Notions of pop-up protests or flash mobs were also particularly innovative approaches. And while it's really important to stress that our findings are specific to the setting of Hong Kong, we note that the tactics that were developed in these protests have also been imitated by protest movements elsewhere, such as in India, in Zimbabwe, and by BLM protesters. In terms of the methodology for our study, we designed it around semi-structured interviews with participants in these protests, and they were all done online. We did interviews with 11 participants. 7 of these had primary protest experience, which were more or less frontliners. They were active members of protest groups, both online and offline. 4 had secondary experience of protest, so they hadn't been on the front line, but they had still taken part in the protest. And our study, in terms of ethics, was approved for self-certification through the Research Ethics Committee of our institution. And we designed our study so that it would minimize the collection of personally identifiable information, which is absolutely key. And finally, data was analyzed through an inductive approach. So we coded our data through 3 coding cycles using NVivo 12, which is qualitative data analysis software. And then absolutely importantly about our methodology is that it's exploratory rather than explanatory. So it provides depth rather than scale, which is also evident from the table and the types of interviews that we did. So we, of course, set out our research findings in the paper as well. And I will, of course, encourage everyone to read the paper. But just to note that the quotes that we kind of bring out in this presentation, I won't read them out, but they're illustrative of wider findings as well. And in terms of the tools, the protest tools used by our participants, they're very much dominated by Telegram and WhatsApp. Telegram in particular was seen to give participants most security and key functionality in terms of being able to create both small close groups and large public groups that each held very specific functions for them, which we'll come back to. WhatsApp was seen as particularly useful because it was already widely used in Hong Kong at the start of the protest, and therefore it enabled participants to form these small trusted affinity groups very early on. And then Signal, whilst it was mentioned by participants, it wasn't widely adopted, or it wasn't really adopted as part of the protests because it required phone numbers. And of course, WhatsApp also requires phone numbers, but because it was widely used by participants before the protest, they felt confident and hence also secure using this tool, which they were already familiar with. So Signal just wasn't seen to give them any more, any additional security or required key functionality. We also found that participants appropriate different consumer apps to meet their specific needs. A key finding that kind of emerged through our data analysis was social organization, or on-the-ground organization, and it centers on a number of key security requirements articulated by the participants. So first, in relation to group types, two types emerged in the data. On the one hand, large public groups that were necessary for organizing and information sharing, as well as collective decision-making. Secondly, these small close-knit affinity groups that were among frontline protesters, they were built around trust relations that were established offline. Security notions largely depended on group types, so anonymity in the large groups, which were assumed to be infiltrated by, for example, the cops, and confidentiality in small close-knit groups. And all participants who had primary protest experience in our study spoke of the challenges of onboarding new members into these close-knit affinity groups. Specific strategies were adopted by different groups, but they were all grounded in offline relations. So meeting people face-to-face at the sites of protests before being accepted into a group was key. And decisions about group membership was very much a collective one. And then finally, on social organization, for participants, the ability to make collective decisions on protest tactics was essential. Examples include real-time voting in these big Telegram channels, but also collective decision-making was a mechanism for ensuring security in numbers, as well as tactical buy-in for future protest activities, such as where to go next. And for the participants, this also meant that group administrators of these large public groups on Telegram, which facilitated collective decision-making and also collective security, then became anonymous leaders of these protests, and they often managed several accounts at the same time. And kind of leading on from that, being able to detect if a group member was arrested was a key functionality and a key security requirement. This is evident throughout the data and through the tools that protesters relied upon, and also their particular monitoring practices, which, while they differed between groups, they in general, when group members went out to protest, some group members would stay behind to monitor their whereabouts. And these practices were all aimed at detecting arrests. So groups would use specific monitoring apps, so through WhatsApp live location sharing function. Other groups would use scheduled messages or regular text messages. But the main reason for wanting to detect arrests related to different post-compromise practices, as we call it. This included rendering legal aid, but importantly, to protect group members. So this was done through two practices. It was done through remote message deletion and also remote removal of group members. So where group administrators of more in one group would delete messages and remove group members who were suspected arrested. And then we set out a number of discussion points in our paper. I'll focus on two high-level ones here. Firstly, collectivity was key in our findings. Usable security studies often focus on individual users. The participants in our studies, however, overwhelmingly noted how security practices were collective in nature, and they demonstrated how information security in process rests on these collective practices to meet the security needs of groups. Information security is therefore negotiated between group members. But also linked to this notion of collectivity is grounding our understanding of security needs in the specific social settings of distinct populations. So different higher risk groups will experience distinct security needs that are very much rooted in their social environment. So one of our arguments is that we need to move beyond the interview studies like this one and actually employ ethnographic methods of inquiry, for example, to understand the actual security needs through immersion in the groups that we aim to study. And then finally, our study also has implications for design, that if we want to meet the security needs of protesters. So first, Telegram's MT protocol, particularly regard to group chats, is a pressing target for cryptanalysis. Second, participants in our study relied heavily on trusted third parties. Thirdly, participants' notion of forward secrecy and post-compromise security very much differed from those in the cryptographic literature, and of course, vice versa. And then finally, we do set out a number of design goals for secure messaging in our paper. Firstly, to support for both small private groups and large public groups, where we have confidentiality in the first one and anonymity in the second one, that we avoid personally identifiable information such as phone numbers when we design secure messaging, and also that we allow group administrators to control membership and also messages within the groups. We also have a number of broader design goals, such as, for instance, the ability to share live locations securely with members of groups. And finally, but importantly, there are a number of limitations to this study, as with all studies of this of this kind of quality, and also in terms of qualitative studies more generally, that we need to take into account when we interpret our findings. So do have a look at those in our paper as well, as they are important to keep in mind when we interpret our findings. That's all I have to say. So the only thing left to say is thank you all very much, but in particular, thank you to our participants who gave generously of their time to engage with this study. So thanks very much.